Right, we're testing fluorocarbon leaders today. Obviously, it's very important to have a good leader line, especially fishing structure, anything like that, because obviously braid does have some abrasion, which we've covered in another video, but really what you want is fluorocarbon. So we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about the thickness. We're going to talk about my, well, anecdotal knot tying, I can give you a bit of advice about it, and the abrasion resistance, which will be on this machine here, which is not really a machine. What it is a downrigger. There's some sandpaper over the spool, and basically what we do is we feed the line through and over the spool, attach it to a weight, so everything's got the same weight, the same length of line, and then we crank the downrigger and see how many turns that the wheel can do before it breaks through the line, hence testing how abrasive resistant it is. The higher the number, obviously, the more it is. The lower, the less abrasion resistant it is. So let's get into it. All right, so FC100 is a Sunline product, a saltwater leader line, which is fairly tough. It's actually fairly tough. To put knots into it, you really need to cinch down on them, which is, it's a bit of a pain, but it is what it is. A tough line means that it's tougher for the braid to cut in. So, you can't have everything. In terms of the length, the thickness is 0.51, which is kind of in the middle. That's going to be in the middle of what most things are going to be. So it was interesting to get it onto the abrasive machine. A lot of people swear by this, that it's really good, really tough leader. So I chucked it on there, and what I found was it was getting into the 50s very regularly. So it got up into the high 50s, didn't roll over into 62 often, but basically shook out into a 58.1. So not too bad. Its thickness is sort of in the middle. Those results will be kind of a little bit below, but yeah, that's basically how it went. So, X-Fluoro OSHA leader, which is a Shimano product, obviously. Look, it's pretty good. I've used it in higher pound before, like 50 pound and up. So obviously this is 30 pound. And the thickness, what is the thickness on this? The thickness is 0.48. It is 0.48. So yeah, basically it's thinner on the thinner side, so anything under 0.5 in this sort of division is going to be on the lower half. In terms of anecdotally, it's knot tying, it's pretty good. It's pretty good at holding a knot. It's fairly thin. It's sort of on the border of both worlds of, thin, supple, holds a knot well. And in terms of abrasion, when we put it on there and started cranking away, it returns in sort of mid 60s up towards 70. So it shook out at about 65.5 turns, which is pretty good. So it's right on the border of the best of both worlds, in my opinion, in terms of holding a knot, its thinness, and its abrasion resistance. So that's how it shook out. All right, Sufix Invisalign fluorocarbon, 100%, crystal clear is what it says. So in terms of this, not a leader that I'd previously used in the real world, but I had a bit of a go of it in here. It's very thin. The thickness is 0.44, so actually quite thin. The second thinnest that we'll be testing today. It's quite on the thin side, and it takes a knot very well. Played around with a couple FG knots on it. Cinches up quite well. So it's right on that borderline as well of toughness. And in terms of toughness, once I chucked it on the machine, we started getting sort of results in the high 60s, rolled over to 70 once or twice. So that brought it up for 68.5 turns. So pretty abrasion resistant. It's right on, in my opinion, it's right up there with the OSHA. It's right on the border of toughness, holds a knot well, and fairly supple. So you're not going to get that memory that it's in the line if you wind it onto your spool. So that's how it shook out. All right, Wilson FC shock leader. Now 100% fluorocarbon, obviously. In terms of this one, it's 0.54, so it's quite thick, fair bit thicker than everything else. In my opinion, it is pretty tough. It is very tough to get a knot on this. You really have to cinch it down, and it keeps memory. So I found that, you know, it sort of keeps that you know, shape like if it was on your spool. So this is more of a, like they say, shock leader. You don't want to be running this onto your spool. So I got it on the abrasion machine, and what we found, it was very, very tough, very tough. It got up into the 80s and rolled over into 90 once. Shook out at 87.3, which is pretty amazing. It's very, very tough, and it is a lot thicker as well. So you need to take that into account. All right, FC Rock. It's a Sunline fluorocarbon, and it was actually my go-to for a long time. Everything from 4 pound all the way up to 50 pound, I think it goes to maximum. So in terms of the thickness, it is the thinnest one that we will. It is the thinnest one that we'll be testing at 0.435. So it's pretty thin. It takes a knot very well. I've used a lot of it. Takes an FG knot really well. Really cuts in, so your braid can hang on to it. So that is good. It's very supple, so if you roll it onto your spool, it doesn't, you know, form that memory and come off in coils. So I find that very good. Now in terms of the abrasion, once I chucked it onto the abrasion machine, I started cranking away on it, and we didn't get as far as I thought we would. I mean, we got into the 50s, but it sort of topped out at high 50s. It got to 55.6, so not the greatest, but it is the thinnest, and in my opinion, the most supple in terms of like taking a knot and things. So you've got to weigh that up. With the thinness, it's averaged out in the mid 50s, and it's fairly supple. So you just have to take everything into account. All right, J-Thread fluorocarbon leader, which is a Daiwa product, obviously. Not a line that I'd used a lot of. In terms of its thickness, it is 0.455, so it's still pretty thin, like the third sort of thinnest one we'll be testing. In terms of the suppleness, it's pretty supple, holds a knot pretty well. You can see it's not very coily at all. So I was interested to chuck it on the machine and give it a look, and we started cranking away, and it's sort of in the middle there, like it's fairly reasonable. So it's sort of getting into the high 50s and rolling over to 60s on the occasion. So it averaged out at 59.7, which is very reasonable. It's quite supple, it takes a knot quite well, it's fairly thin, and it's fairly abrasion resistant. So it's right in the middle there, very, very reasonable. All right, Toray Fluoro Power Game. Talks a big game. Not a leader that I'd used. It was a recommendation from the tackle store that it is pretty good. So I was interested to have a look at it, played around with a few knots on it. Takes a knot pretty well, actually. It's fairly thin, like it's 0.47, so it's sort of fourth thinnest, fifth thinnest, something like that, right in the middle there. So it's fairly reasonable in that regard. It ties good knots, like I said, so it was interesting to get it on to the abrasion machine. Started cranking away. We sort of had a spread of around about 10 turns on this one, which was unusual. A lot of the other ones were clustered in tight. This one was going from 45 at its lowest, and then sort of ranging into the high 50s on occasion. So it was actually quite spread, which was interesting. I'm not sure what I put that down to, but anyways, it got out to about 55.2. So it's not bad, like it's reasonable again, with the suppleness, taking a knot, and its thinness all factored into its abrasion resistance. All right, so Black Magic Leader, tough fluorocarbon. And I can attest to that because I tried to use this once in 80 pound. Very, very tough leader. It is very tough. It's actually very tough to get into the packaging as well. In terms of its thickness, it is sitting at 0.5, so right in the middle there. That's sort of like mid-range for these leaders, it seems. Now, if I can get some out of this packet, there it is there. Now, it's very thick, it's very tough, very hard to get a knot down on it. Really have to cinch it down to try and get a knot, especially an FG knot to cinch down on this, very difficult. So with its thickness and its toughness, it was interesting to put it on the machine, and I'll tell you what, blew everything else out of the water. It's got into the 80s easily, into the high 90s on occasion. So there was a spread of about 10 from sort of mid 80s to the high 90s and averaged out at 89.6, which is a bloody workhorse, but obviously you need to take into account also that this is sort of like a shock leader. You don't want to be winding it onto your spool, so it's sort of a shorter leader. You really need to cinch those knots down. So obviously it's good for some applications and not for others, and you just have to pick what you want. Okay, so my 2 cents here, obviously Blackmagic won it, but it is the second thickest and the most tough. So you just need to take that into account. The Wilson as well is up there with it in terms of toughness and thickness, hence why they have the best abrasion resistance. But you probably don't want to run a long leader with those. FG knots, you really need to cinch them down. Whereas the lower, thinner, more supple, FC Rock, Daiwa, Toray, they are going to be where you can run a long leader and wind it onto your spool and not have that coily sort of effect. Take a knot very well, and they're very thin, so you're going to get better castability, etc. But in the middle, the Suffix, the Osha, that's where I'm going to put my money in the future. They are very reasonable thickness, very thin. The Suffix is quite thin, second thinnest, and its abrasion resistance was really good. The Osha actually quite thin as well, and abrasion resistance are very good as well. So that's your middle ground. So if you want something that's going to do everything, those two there, that's where you put your money down. I can't test them all, so leave whatever I missed down the bottom. You know, there's Vanish, there's all sorts of stuff. I'm not going to go through them all, so leave them down below and we might do a part 2. Until then, I'll see you on I still don't have a catch rate, so I'll see you on the next one. How do I look? Good? Yes, I look good. All right, good for good. Good for good for. Good for. Good, good. Come on, you fucker, what are you doing? With the leaf blower. Mate, how am I going to do this with the leaf blower? Fucking joking. Right, fucking I nearly got all the way to the end without fucking that one up.